Come in, settle back, let your eyes close if they want to. Tonight I want to tell you about a world that used to exist where a desert now sits, a world so different from what we imagine when we hear its name, that most people never learn it was ever there at all. This is a true story carried in stone and mud and the bones of animals that should not by any modern reckoning have lived where they lived. So make yourself comfortable. We have a long night ahead of us and a great deal of ground to cover. Here is what is at stake in the story I am about to tell you. An entire world, green and wet and full of life, disappeared within the span of a few human generations, and the people who called it home had to decide again and again whether to stay and hope the rains would return, or to leave everything they had ever known and walk toward a horizon that offered no guarantees at all. Some of them stayed too long, some of them left too late. And the choice they faced quietly, without warning, sirens or written prophecy, still shapes the modern world in ways most of us never think to ask about. Picture a woman standing at the edge of a lake somewhere in what is now the middle of the Sahara Desert roughly 7,000 years ago. The water in front of her stretches farther than she can see, rimmed with reeds and the tracks of hippopotamuses that graze along its shallows in the cool of early morning. Her cattle move behind her, dozens of them, lowing softly, their hides catching the pale gold light. She has grown up hearing that the lake has always been here, that her mother's mother's mother watered her herds on this same shore. She kneels, cups water in her hands and drinks. Somewhere nearby, though she does not know it yet, the pattern of rain that has fed this lake for centuries has already begun almost imperceptibly to change. It is strange to imagine, isn't it, standing in the middle of what we now call the world's largest hot desert and picturing crocodiles sliding through open water, giraffes moving between acacia trees, fishing communities settled along riverbanks that no longer exist in any visible form. And yet the evidence for exactly this kind of world is carved directly into the rock walls of the Sahara itself. Thousands of images left by people who painted what they saw around them. Cattle herds and swimmers and hunting parties in places so dry today that a modern visitor might wonder if the artists were simply imagining another world entirely. They were not imagining it. They were living in it. What changed was not the story. What changed was the climate itself, and the story is what got left behind. Before we go further into that story, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, something patient and honest, willing to sit with the strange and the vanished rather than rushing past, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who might be lying awake tonight wanting exactly this. And I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from and what drew you to a story about a desert that used to be green. Now get comfortable and let's begin. The Sahara has not always worn the face we know today. For most of human memory, certainly, for as long as recorded history has existed, it has been a place defined by absence, by sand seas that swallow entire horizons, by heat that can kill an unprepared traveller within a single afternoon, by silence broken only by wind moving over dunes that shift and reform with no one watching. It is easy, looking at satellite images of the modern Sahara, to assume this emptiness is simply what the region has always been, a permanent feature of the Earth's design, as fixed and unchanging as the equator itself. But the Earth does not work that way. And the Sahara is in truth one of the most dramatic examples of just how much a landscape can transform within a relatively short span of geological time. Roughly 11,000 years ago, something shifted in the pattern of the Earth's orbit until a slow astronomical adjustment that nudged the African monsoon rains further north than they reach today. Rain that now falls when it falls at all hundreds of miles to the south began instead to soak the Sahara itself, filling ancient basins, feeding rivers that had lain dry for millennia, coaxing grasses and shrubs up through soil that had known only sand. Lakes formed where no lakes had been in living memory, some of them enormous, rivaling the size of small seas. One of them in the region of what is now Chad may have covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea at its peak, a body of water so vast it is difficult to picture standing on the same ground today, staring at nothing but heat, shimmer and stone. Into this transformed landscape came people and animals, and an entire ecosystem that modern visitors to the Sahara would find almost unrecognizable. Elephants moved across what had recently been barren rock, fish-filled rivers that cut new channels through ancient stone, and human communities drawn by water and grazing land began to settle in numbers that the desert in its dry state could never have supported. They herded cattle, they fished. They built lives around the rhythm of a landscape that felt to them entirely permanent because within any single human lifetime it was. Nobody living in that world had any reason to suspect that the rain sustaining it were not a fixed and eternal feature of their home, but the temporary result of a slow, celestial adjustment that had already quietly begun to reverse. That reversal did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually at first, then with a speed that surprises even the researchers who study it today, and it did not treat every part of the Sahara equally. Some regions dried slowly enough that communities had generations to adapt to migrate to reorganize their entire way of life around a shrinking water supply. Others, according to the evidence preserved in ancient lake beds and sediment layers, seem to have crossed a kind of threshold far more abruptly, tipping from green and wet to dry and hostile, within a period that some scientists now believe may have been closer to a single human lifetime than the slow-motion transformation once assumed. To understand how a world so full of life could vanish so completely, and to understand what it meant for the people who lived through it, we have to go back to the beginning of that world, to the moment the rains first arrived and turned an empty stretch of stone into something green. 10,000 years before the age of the pyramids, before any of the civilizations most people learn about in school, had so much as laid their first stone, the region we now call the Sahara begins to breathe. It happens slowly, the way most true transformations do not with a single dramatic storm, but with a shift in the position of monsoon rains that had for thousands of years prior stayed locked over the tropics far to the south. The Earth wobbles slightly on its axis over long cycles, tilting its orientation toward the sun in patterns that repeat across tens of thousands of years, and one of the quiet consequences of that wobble is that the belt of summer rain driven by the West African monsoon creeps northward, inch by inch, season by season, until it reaches deep into land that had for as long as anyone or anything could remember known nothing but drought. But the transformation this brings is difficult to overstate. Sand dunes that had stood undisturbed for millennia find themselves anchored by the root systems as grasses take hold in soil that had forgotten what growth felt like. Ancient river channels dry for so long that their very shapes had begun to erode under wind filled again with moving water. Basins that once held nothing but cracked earth become lakes, some of them small and seasonal, others so large they reorganize the geography of an entire region. Researchers studying the ancient lake sediments beneath what is now the Chad Basin have found evidence suggesting the water there once stood so deep and so wide that comparing it to a modern sea is not an exaggeration, but simply the most accurate description available. Scholars still debate the exact peak size of that ancient lake, since the evidence comes from scattered core samples and shoreline traces rather than any single complete measurement, but even the most conservative estimates describe a body of water that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone standing on that same ground today. Into this newly green world life arrives with startling speed. Seeds long dormant in the soil or carried in on wind and animal migration begin to sprout into grasslands and scattered woodland. Herds of antelope move across plains that had within living memory of the land itself been empty stone. Elephants leave tracks in mud where for centuries there had been no mud to leave a mark in at all. and perhaps most strikingly, given how thoroughly we now associate the Sahara with drought and heat, crocodiles take up residence in the new lakes and rivers. An image so at odds with the modern desert that when rock engravings depicting them were first properly studied by archaeologists, some assumed the artists must have been describing animals encountered on some distant journey, rather than creatures living in their own backyard. They were wrong to assume that. The crocodiles were local, isolated populations of them, remarkably still survive today in a handful of remote desert pools in places like Mauritania, descendants of that ancient wet world clinging on in shrinking puddles of water, long after the lakes and rivers around them disappeared, a living relic of a Sahara most people never imagined could have existed. Human beings do not take long to notice what this transformed landscape offers. Communities begin moving into the region from multiple directions, drawn by water, by grazing land for animals, by the simple, powerful pull of a place where survival suddenly requires far less struggle than it once did. Some of these early inhabitants are hunter-gatherers following the herds of wild game that now roam freely across what had recently been barren rock. Others bring something new with them, something that will come to define much of Saharan life for thousands of years afterward: cattle. The domestication and herding of cattle across this newly green Sahara represents one of the more quietly remarkable developments in early human history, and it happens according to the archaeological record remarkably early, with some evidence suggesting cattle keeping in parts of the Sahara may predate similarly organized cattle culture in other well-known early farming regions. The evidence for this remains a subject of real scholarly discussion, since dating early pastoral sites with precision is difficult, and the record is incomplete in places, but the broad picture is not seriously disputed. Cattle become for many of these communities more than livestock. They become the organizing center of an entire way of life. It is worth sitting for a moment with what daily existence might have looked like for these early Saharan communities, because it is so far removed from anything we associate with the region today. Mornings likely begin with a movement of herds toward water cattle, guided along paths worn smooth by repetition children, walking alongside adults who have made this same short journey more times than they could count. The lakes and seasonal ponds that dot the landscape support not just cattle but fish caught with harpoons and hooks crafted from bone, and the remains of these fishing tools found scattered across sites that are now hundreds of miles from any permanent water source offer some of the clearest physical proof of just how different this landscape once was. Pottery appears in the archaeological record from this period as well, some of the oldest ceramic traditions found anywhere on the African continent, decorated with patterns pressed into the wet clay before firing a small human detail that speaks to lives with enough stability and surplus to spend time on beauty rather than pure survival. What makes this era so vivid to us today, thousands of years later, is not simply the physical evidence buried in lake beds and campsites, though that evidence matters enormously. It is the art. Across the central Sahara, in places like the Tassili Niger Plateau, in what is now Algeria and the Gilf Kebir region, along the border of modern Egypt and Libya, ancient people left behind thousands of paintings and engravings on rock surfaces, images that have survived in some cases for close to 10,000 years. These are not crude scratches. Many of them show remarkable detail and clear artistic intention, cattle rendered with individual markings and postures, human figures dancing or herding, or simply standing together in groups, swimmers depicted mid-stroke in water that in the world these artists inhabited was simply part of daily life. When European explorers first documented these paintings in the 20th century, the sheer scale of the artistic records startled even seasoned archaeologists, since nothing about the surrounding desert landscape at the time hinted that such a world or such a population had ever existed there at all. There is something worth pausing on here. a quiet undercurrent to this story that becomes more meaningful the longer you sit with it. The people who painted these images, who herded cattle along the shores of lakes that no longer exist, who fished in rivers now buried under centuries of drifting sand, had no reason to believe any of it was temporary. A lake that has fed your family for generations does not feel like a passing phase. A grassland that has always supported your herds does not feel fragile. The stability of a green Sahara from the perspective of the people living inside it would have felt as permanent and unquestionable as the desert feels to us now, looking at satellite photographs and assuming this barren landscape has simply always been this way. Both perceptions were wrong in their own moment about the true nature of the ground beneath their feet. The Sahara during the long green period that researchers now call the African Humid Period was not uniform. Different regions received different amounts of rainfall, supported different densities of population, dried out at different rates when the climate eventually began to shift again. Some areas remained relatively stable for centuries after others had already begun losing their water. This unevenness matters because it means the story of what happened next is not a single simple narrative of one world ending all at once, but something more complicated, more staggered, and in some ways more unsettling. A slow unravelling that different communities experienced in different ways at different times with different degrees of warning. For now, though, the world these people inhabited is thriving. The rains are steady enough, the lakes are full enough, the grazing land is generous enough that a visitor from our own time, somehow transported into that landscape, would struggle to reconcile what they were seeing with any image of the Sahara they'd ever known. Cattle move in great herds across open plains. Children learn to swim in water their grandparents once crossed by boat. And somewhere quietly, almost imperceptibly, the same astronomical rhythm that brought the rains north in the first place has already begun ever so slowly to carry them back south again, though no one standing on that green and living ground has any way of knowing it yet. The green Sahara that takes shape across these centuries is not filled by a single people moving in from one direction, and this is a detail easy to lose sight of when the story gets simplified into broad strokes. Genetic and archaeological evidence gathered over the past several decades points toward multiple waves of settlement arriving from different directions and at different times, converging on this newly hospitable land the way water finds its way into a low place from many separate slopes. Some communities appear to trace their roots toward the Nile Valley to the east. Others show connections stretching toward the Near East, carried, perhaps along early trade and migration routes that predate anything we would recognize as organized long-distance travel. Still others seem to descend from populations already present in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, moving north as the grasslands opened before them. The Sahara in this period becomes less a single homeland and more a crossroads, a meeting place for peoples who might never otherwise have shared the same stretch of ground. This matters because it complicates a version of the story that might otherwise sound too neat, too much like a single tribe simply walking into an empty paradise and settling down. The reality, as far as the evidence allows us to reconstruct it, is messier and more human than that. Different groups likely competed for the best grazing land and the most reliable water sources. Cultural practices, tool styles, and burial customs vary meaningfully from one region of the Sahara to another during this period, suggesting distinct communities with their own traditions living within a few hundred miles of each other, sometimes trading, sometimes keeping their distance, sometimes very likely coming into conflict over resources that, however abundant compared to the desert we know today, were still not infinite. Scholars still debate how much direct contact and exchange occurred between these different groups, since the physical evidence for trade routes across this period is fragmentary, pieced together from scattered similarities in tool design and ornament rather than any continuous archaeological trail. What unites many of these otherwise distinct communities, though, is the cow. It is worth pausing here on just how deeply cattle shape the social world of the Green Sahara, because the relationship goes far beyond simple subsistence. Across many pastoral societies of this era, cattle appear to function as a kind of currency, a marker of wealth and status, a medium through which marriages are negotiated and debts are settled, and standing within a community is measured. The animals are given individual names in some traditions that persist into much later African pastoral cultures, treated less as anonymous livestock and more as members of an extended household. Rock art from this period supports this interpretation, vividly showing cattle rendered with enormous care and specificity, their coat patterns and horn shapes individually distinguished in a way that would make little sense if these were viewed as interchangeable resources rather than animals with personal significance to their owners. A modern viewer looking at some of these engravings, seeing the tenderness with which a particular animal has been depicted, might reasonably wonder whether they are looking at livestock or at something closer to a beloved companion. And the honest answer, most researchers now believe, is probably both at once. There is a site deep in what is now the Nubian desert of southern Egypt that offers one of the more remarkable and lesser-known windows into just how organized and sophisticated these early Saharan communities became. It is called Nabta Playa, and beneath its sun-scorched surface today lie the remains of a complex that most people, even those with a genuine interest in ancient history, have simply never heard of. Sometime around 7,000 years ago, the people living around this seasonal lake basin constructed a circle of standing stones carefully arranged, some of them aligned with the position of the sun at the summer solstice. It is by a meaningful margin older than Stonehenge, older than the stone circles of the British Isles that so many people picture when they imagine ancient astronomical monuments, and it sits not in a lush, well-documented landscape, but in what is today one of the most punishing, waterless stretches of desert on the entire planet, a placement that feels almost impossible until you remember that when it was built, this ground was anything but empty. The purpose of the stone arrangement at Nabta Playa remains a subject of genuine scholarly discussion, and it would be dishonest to present any single explanation as fully settled fact. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that the site served at least in part as a seasonal calendar, helping the community track the return of the life-giving summer rains that filled the surrounding lake basin and made continued habitation possible. Nearby, archaeologists have also uncovered what appear to be deliberately constructed burial mounds, including one containing the remains of cattle interred with the level of care and ceremony typically reserved in most ancient cultures for human beings of considerable status. Whether this reflects a form of ritual sacrifice, a genuine reverence for cattle as spiritually significant animals, or some combination, the researchers have not yet fully untangled, the evidence remains incomplete, though the careful placement and construction of the burial itself leaves little doubt that this was no casual act. What a site like Nabta Playa suggests beyond its specific archaeological details is a level of social organization that might surprise anyone who pictures early pastoral societies as simple, loosely structured groups moving wherever the rain happened to fall. Building and maintaining a monument of standing stones, coordinating the labor required to quarry transport and precisely position them requires exactly the kind of stable, cooperative, multi-generational community structure we tend to associate with much later, more famously documented civilizations. It requires people who plan for a future beyond the current season, who trust that the knowledge they encode into these stones will still matter to their children and grandchildren. It requires, in other words, a community with genuine confidence in the permanence of the world they are building it within. That confidence extended, it seems, into how these communities organize the land itself. Evidence gathered from numerous sites across the central and eastern Sahara suggests something resembling territorial boundaries developing around the most reliable water sources, with certain groups maintaining what appears to be long-term generational claims to particular lakes, wells, or grazing regions. This is a meaningful detail because it tells us these were not simply nomadic wanderers moving at random across an open landscape, but communities with a genuine sense of home, of inherited place of land, passed down and defended much the way settled agricultural societies elsewhere in the ancient world defended their fields. The distinction between nomadic and settled life, so often presented as a clean divide in popular retellings of ancient history, blurs considerably when you look closely at how these Saharan pastoralists actually organised their existence. And there is a quieter, more intimate layer to this story worth sitting with for a moment, one that rarely makes it into broader histories of the region. Burial practices uncovered across numerous Saharan sites from this period show clear evidence of grief expressed through deliberate, careful ritual. Bodies are positioned with intention, sometimes accompanied by personal ornaments, beads carved from ostrich eggshell pendants shaped from stone or bone, small objects that carried enough meaning to someone that they were placed permanently alongside the dead rather than kept and used by the living. In several instances, archaeologists have found the remains of children buried with particular care, wrapped or positioned in ways that suggest a depth of mourning entirely recognizable across the thousands of years separating those parents from us. It is easy, looking at ancient peoples through the flattening lens of deep time, to think of them primarily as data points, as case studies in climate adaptation or migration pattern. But these were people who loved, who grieved, who buried their children with the same aching tenderness any parent today would recognize instantly, and who had no reason whatsoever to suspect that the green and generous world sustaining their lives was already quietly beginning its long retreat. For now, in this stretch of the story, none of that retreat has become visible yet. The communities scattered across the Sahara during this period are, by most available evidence, growing rather than shrinking, expanding their herds, refining their tools, building monuments meant to outlast any single lifetime. Trade in small luxury items, ornamental stones, shell beads carried inland from distant coastlines suggest networks of exchange reaching further than we might expect from societies so often imagined as isolated. Pottery styles grow more varied and more skillfully made. Rock art becomes more elaborate, depicting not just individual animals, but entire scenes, hunting parties, ceremonial gatherings, groups of figures arranged in ways that seem to tell stories rather than simply record the presence of a herd. This is a civilization in every meaningful sense of that word, even if it left behind no cities of stone for later visitors to marvel at. It left behind something else instead, scattered across thousands of miles of rock and sand, waiting patiently for people thousands of years in the future to notice it was there at all. What comes next in this story is the peak of everything these communities built, the fullest flowering of a world that even now still had no reason to doubt its own permanence. There is a particular kind of mourning that repeats itself with only small variations across thousands of Saharan settlements during the centuries we now consider the height of this civilization, and it is worth spending a moment inside one of them before we widen the lens again. The air is cool, the way desert mornings often are, even in landscapes far greener than the one we usually picture. Smoke rises from small fires where the previous night's meal is being reheated. Somewhere nearby, a group of young herders argues good-naturedly over whose turn it is to walk the cattle out to the farthest grazing ground, the one with the sweetest grass but the longest walk. It is such an ordinary scene, so recognisably human in its small frictions and small comforts, that it is almost jarring to remember we are picturing it in the middle of what is today the most extreme desert on the planet. By this point in the story, somewhere in the range of 6,500 years ago, the pastoral cultures of the Green Sahara are not simply surviving. They are flourishing and flourishing in ways that leave behind evidence sophisticated enough to still surprise the archaeologists studying it today. Population density across the well-watered regions of the central Sahara appears to reach its peak during this window, with settlements clustered thickly enough around the most reliable lakes and watercourses that some researchers have begun describing certain areas less as scattered camps, and more as something approaching regional population centres. That is a bold word to use about a place most people still picture as empty, and I will admit it made me sit back a little the first time I came across it in the research for this story. A population centre in the middle of the Sahara. What allows this density is not luck. It is a genuinely sophisticated relationship with the land refined over generations. Communities by this point are managing their cattle herds with real strategic intention, rotating grazing areas seasonally, to avoid overuse of any single patch of grassland, a practice that closely resembles what modern range management specialists would recognize as sustainable pastoralism. Some sites show evidence of small-scale water management as well, modest earthworks and channels that appear designed to direct seasonal rainfall toward preferred grazing basins, rather than simply letting it run off unused. None of this is agriculture in the sense we usually mean the word with fields and planted crops, though there is growing evidence that some Saharan communities during this period were also gathering and possibly cultivating wild grains, a detail that blurs the tidy line historians once drew between hunter-gatherer, pastoralist and farmer. The most widely accepted reconstruction today treats these categories less as fixed stages a society passes through in order, and more as tools people mixed and matched according to what their particular stretch of the Green Sahara actually offered them. It is worth asking, and I think it is a fair question for any of us lying here in the dark tonight to sit with for a moment. What does it actually feel like to live inside a civilization at its peak without knowing that is what you're doing? None of these people woke up thinking of themselves as living through a golden age. There was no golden age to compare themselves against, no fading empire in living memory to serve as a cautionary tale, no sense that abundance was anything other than the ordinary condition of the world. That is in a strange way one of the most universal truths this story carries. Very few people in any era, in any place, ever recognize the peak while they are standing inside it. It only becomes visible afterward from the vantage point of what follows. The artistic record from this period supports the picture of a confident, expansive culture in vivid detail. Rock art from sites across the central Sahara, particularly in the Tassili Najjar Plateau, grows noticeably more complex during this stretch of centuries, moving beyond simple depictions of individual animals into elaborate, composed scenes. Some panels show what appear to be ceremonial gatherings, dozens of human figures arranged together, some wearing what look like decorative headdresses or masks, others positioned in postures that many archaeologists interpret as dance. There is one particularly striking image found in a rock shelter in the Tassili region showing a circle of figures around a central form that some researchers have suggested may depict a ritual or spiritual ceremony, though I want to be honest with you that this interpretation remains genuinely debated. Scholars still argue over how much of this rock art reflects literal daily life and how much reflects mythology, spiritual belief, or storytelling traditions. We simply do not have the context to fully decode. What is not in serious dispute is the confidence and skill behind the brushwork itself, pigments made from ground minerals applied with a precision that speaks to artists who had time, materials, and cultural encouragement to develop real technical mastery. There is a detail from this period that tends to surprise people, and it concerns clothing rather than cattle or ceremony. Fragments of textile and the tools associated with textile production, spindle whorls, and evidence of fibre processing have been recovered from several Saharan sites dating to this window, suggesting that at least some of these communities were producing woven cloth well before it became common in many other parts of the ancient world. Rock art from the period occasionally shows figures wearing what appear to be fitted garments, rather than simple draped hides decorated with patterns that mirror the geometric designs found on pottery from the same communities. It is a small thing, perhaps, in the sweep of a story this large, but I find it quietly moving to picture someone in the middle of the Sahara, thousands of years before anyone had heard of Egypt or Mesopotamia, choosing a particular pattern to weave into their clothing simply because they liked the way it looked. Trade networks during this period also reach further than the isolated image of desert pastoralism usually suggests. Marine shells originating from the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts have been found at sites deep in the Saharan interior, hundreds of miles from either body of water, evidence of exchange networks that must have passed the shells hand to hand across considerable distances, likely over generations rather than single journeys. Similarly, certain stone tool materials found at central Saharan sites can be traced back to source quarries a significant distance away, suggesting either long-distance travel or more likely a chain of trade relationships connecting communities across the breadth of the Green Sahara. None of this required carts or ships or any of the infrastructure we typically associate with ancient trade. It required only the patient, repeated exchange of neighbour to neighbour over enough time that a single seashell might travel farther than any one person who ever touched it. And yet even at this height, even with lakes full and herds thriving and rock walls filling with increasingly confident art, there are threads in the evidence worth pausing on, small signs that not everything about this world was uniformly stable. Isotope analysis conducted on animal remains from certain sites, a technique that allows researchers to reconstruct details about ancient diet and even ancient rainfall patterns from the chemical signatures left behind in bone and tooth enamel, has revealed subtle regional variation during this period that some scientists interpret as early evidence of localized rainfall inconsistency, even while the broader region remained on the whole well-watered. The evidence remains far from conclusive, and it would be misleading to suggest anyone living through this golden stretch of Saharan history was aware of any looming concern. But looking back with the advantage of thousands of years of hindsight, and with tools these ancient herders could never have imagined, we can see faint early fingerprints of pattern that will, before too many more centuries pass, become impossible to ignore. What strikes me most sitting with all of this is how deeply this civilization believed in its own permanence and how understandable that belief was. They had generations of evidence behind them. Grandparents who had watered cattle at the same lake as their grandparents before them. Monuments built to track solstices decades and centuries into an assumed future. Trade relationships passed down through families who had never known a version of the world without them. If you had stood among them at this moment in the story and suggested that within a relatively short span of time by the standards of the deep past, all of this would begin to unravel, I suspect you would have been met with polite disbelief, the same disbelief most of us would offer if someone suggested the rivers and cities structuring our own lives might one day simply cease to exist. It is a very human thing to mistake the length of your own memory for the length of the world's patience. Because somewhere in these same centuries of abundance, quietly without ceremony or warning, the very forces that had once carried the rains north across the Sahara begin with the same slow astronomical patience that brought them to reverse their course again. Nothing about daily life changes yet. The lakes remain full, the cattle remain fat. The rock art continues to grow more elaborate, more confident, more sure of its own permanence with every passing generation. But somewhere out past the edge of what any single lifetime could perceive, the long quiet work of undoing this world has already almost imperceptibly begun. If you were to ask a climate scientist today what a civilization's first real warning sign looks like, they would probably tell you it rarely looks like a warning at all. It looks like an unusually dry season that everyone assumes is simply bad luck. It looks like a lake receding a little further than usual before the rains return and top it back up so that within a year or two the memory of the shortfall fades entirely. This is where the story turns now into that quiet, deceptive early stage of change, the kind that announces itself only in hindsight, and it is worth sitting with how genuinely difficult it must have been for anyone living through it to recognize what they were actually witnessing. Somewhere around 6,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on the specific region of the Sahara in question, the pattern of monsoon rainfall that had sustained this green world for millennia begins to weaken. This is not a sudden event. It is a trend visible today only because researchers can compare sediment layers laid down year after year in ancient lake beds, each layer a kind of diary entry written by the climate itself, recording how much water flowed in and how much organic material grew and died in a given season. Read one of these layers alone and you would learn almost nothing. Read thousands of them in sequence, as paleoclimatologists have done at sites across the Sahara over the past several decades, and a pattern begins to emerge, one that the people living through those actual centuries had no equivalent way of perceiving, because no single human lifetime offered enough data points to notice the trend forming beneath their feet. What makes this particular stretch of the story so quietly unsettling is the geography of how the drying unfolds. It does not happen everywhere at once, and it does not happen evenly. The southern and eastern reaches of the Green Sahara, closer to the retreating edge of the monsoon rains, begin to feel the change first, their lakes shrinking a little more each decade than they refill their grazing land, growing patchier and less reliable. Meanwhile, communities living farther north or in particularly favourable basins may continue to experience relatively stable conditions for generations longer, sheltered by local geography, or simply by the slower pace at which the drying reaches them. This unevenness means that for a very long stretch of this transition, there is no single unified experience of crisis. There are only scattered, disconnected pockets of hardship, each community assuming its own difficulty as a local problem, a bad decade, a run of misfortune rather than the leading edge of something continental in scale. Isn't that in its own way one of the more haunting parts of this story? That the people most affected may have had the least ability to understand what was actually happening to them, precisely because they could only ever see their own small corner of a very large pattern. There is a particular kind of evidence that helps bring this slow unravelling into focus, and it comes from an unlikely source, the bones of the cattle themselves. Isotopic analysis of animal remains from sites spanning this transitional period reveals shifting patterns in diet and water source that track closely with the broader climatic decline, offering researchers a kind of biological thermometer for regions where written or oral records simply do not exist. In several excavated herds, researchers have found evidence suggesting cattle were being moved across increasingly long distances in search of adequate grazing, a level of mobility that implies communities were already working harder year over year simply to maintain herds that had once thrived with comparatively little effort. This is not evidence of catastrophe, it is evidence of strain of a way of life that still functioned, but functioned with growing difficulty, the kind of change a community might absorb quietly for a generation or two without ever naming it as decline. Something else changes during this period that offers a strangely intimate window into how people responded, and it concerns burial practices. At several sites dating to this transitional window, archaeologists have noted a shift in how the dead are interred, with certain communities beginning to bury their deceased closer to the remaining reliable water sources rather than in the more scattered locations used in earlier centuries. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of population consolidation, communities drawing closer together around shrinking resources, their sense of home contracting along with the landscape that sustained it. Others suggest it may reflect a growing spiritual or symbolic association between water and the afterlife, as the reliability of water itself became something communities could no longer simply take for granted. The evidence remains genuinely open to interpretation here, and scholars continue to debate which explanation, if either alone, captures what was actually happening in the minds of the people making these choices. What both interpretations share, though, is the suggestion of a world quietly reorganizing itself around loss well before that loss had become impossible to ignore. It would be easy telling this story to imagine these changes as producing something like panic, but that would almost certainly be the wrong picture, and it is worth correcting it gently. Human communities, especially ones with generations of accumulated ecological knowledge, tend to respond to slow environmental change with slow practical adaptation rather than dramatic upheaval. Evidence from several central Saharan sites suggests exactly this kind of quiet adjustment taking place during this period. Herding strategies shift to rely more heavily on goats and sheep alongside cattle, since these smaller animals require less water and can survive on the increasingly patchy grazing land that cattle alone could no longer fully sustain. Settlement patterns show communities beginning to split into smaller, more mobile groups during parts of the year, spreading out to make fuller use of whatever scattered grazing remained available, then reconvening at more reliable water sources during the harshest months. None of this reads in the archaeological record as a society in crisis. It reads as a society adapting competently and quietly the way people generally do when the ground beneath them shifts slowly enough to allow for a response. And yet adaptation of this kind has limits, and the evidence suggests those limits were beginning in certain regions to be tested. At a scattering of sites dating to the later portion of this transitional period, archaeologists have found what appear to be abandoned settlements camps left with tools and pottery still in place. The kind of abandonment that suggests a departure made with some urgency rather than a slow-planned relocation. What caused any individual abandonment of this kind remains impossible to say with certainty from the physical evidence alone, and it would be irresponsible to claim more precision here than the record actually supports. It could reflect a particularly severe dry season that pushed a marginal settlement past its breaking point. It could reflect conflict with a neighbouring group over increasingly contested resources, a possibility supported by scattered evidence of defensive structures appearing at a small number of sites from this period, structures that had no clear equivalent in the earlier, more abundant centuries of the Green Sahara. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that both pressures, environmental and social, were likely operating together by this point, each intensifying the other in ways that would have felt to the people living through them less like two separate problems and more like a single tightening circumstance with no easy way out. There is one particularly striking piece of evidence from this period worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures something the broader statistics and sediment cores cannot quite convey on their own. At a site in the central Sahara, researchers uncovered the remains of what appears to have been a small cattle herd that died together, their bones showing no signs of having been butchered or used, an unusual finding in a culture that typically made careful, near total use of any animal that died. The most widely supported interpretation is that this herd perished during a particularly severe drought, likely stranded too far from remaining water sources for their owners to reach them in time or to safely make the journey themselves. It is a small, quiet tragedy thousands of years removed from us now, and yet it is not difficult to imagine the grief behind it. A family or a community watching animals they had raised and depended on, animals that in many of these cultures carried real emotional as well as economic weight, succumb to a landscape that had simply stopped providing what it once had. What makes this stretch of the story so different in feeling from what came before is not any single dramatic event. It is the slow accumulation of small strains, each one survivable on its own, each one absorbed through some combination of adaptation, resilience, and quiet sacrifice, but each one also narrowing however slightly the margin available for whatever came next. The Green Sahara at this point in its long history has not collapsed. It has begun instead to ask something new of the people living within it, a kind of patience and flexibility their ancestors' generations back in the earliest and most abundant years of this world never had to summon at all. And somewhere in the decades still ahead, that quiet, manageable strain is about to meet something else entirely, a shift in the climate system itself that will move far faster and far more decisively than anything these communities have yet had to face. For a long time, the scientists who first studied the end of the Green Sahara assumed they were looking at a slow fade, a gradual dimming that might have stretched across 2,000 or 3,000 years, mirroring the gradual arrival of the rains that had created this world in the first place. It seemed the reasonable assumption. Climate, after all, tends to change slowly in increments too small for any single generation to notice. But when researchers began drilling into the seafloor off the coast of West Africa in the 1990s, extracting long cylindrical cores of sediment that had drifted out from the Sahara on the wind and settled layer upon layer onto the ocean floor for tens of thousands of years, what they found did not match that gentle assumption at all. Each layer of dust in those cores represents a snapshot of conditions on land at the time it was deposited, and by measuring how the composition of that dust changes from one layer to the next, researchers can reconstruct with startling resolution how quickly the Sahara's vegetation cover shifted over time. What those cores revealed when the data was finally analysed in full was not a slow fade, it was closer to a collapse, across a window that some researchers now place at only a few hundred years, and that certain regional studies suggest may have unfolded in pockets within a single century or two. The vegetation cover across large stretches of the Sahara appears to have shifted dramatically from grassland and shrub to the bare, wind-scoured desert we recognise today. A change that earlier generations of scientists assumed must have taken millennia, may in significant portions of the region have taken place within the span of a grandparent's lifetime. How is that possible? How does a climate system that shifted gradually over thousands of years to create the Green Sahara in the first place manage to reverse itself so much faster than it arrived? This is where the science becomes genuinely fascinating and where the honest answer requires acknowledging real ongoing scientific debate rather than presenting a single tidy explanation. The leading theory developed and refined by climate scientists over the past several decades centers on something called a vegetation feedback loop, and it is worth taking a moment to understand it because it reveals something important about how fragile even seemingly stable natural systems can be once they cross a certain threshold. Here is the basic mechanism stripped down to its essence. Plants are not passive passengers in a climate system. They actively shape the weather around them. Vegetation cover darkens the land surface compared to bare sand, which affects how much solar heat that ground absorbs and radiates back into the atmosphere. Plants also release moisture into the air through a natural process, and that moisture contributes to cloud formation and ultimately to rainfall. In other words, a green landscape does not simply benefit from monsoon rain. It actively helps generate and sustain the very rainfall it depends on in a self-reinforcing cycle. For as long as the underlying orbital conditions kept the monsoon rains flowing into the Sahara, this feedback loop worked in the region's favour with vegetation, helping lock in and even amplify a wetter climate beyond what orbital forcing alone might have produced. But feedback loops by their nature run in both directions. As the underlying orbital shift that had originally pulled the monsoon rains northward slowly began to reverse, rainfall started to decline just slightly incrementally across large portions of the Sahara. That slight decline was enough in the more marginal and already fragile regions to begin killing off vegetation at the edges. And once vegetation started dying back in meaningful quantities, the feedback loop that had once worked to sustain the rains began instead working to choke them off, since less vegetation meant less moisture released into the atmosphere, which meant less cloud formation, which meant even less rainfall, which killed off still more vegetation. Once this reversal gained enough momentum in a given region, the system did not need much additional push from the slow orbital shift to spiral rapidly toward its new dry equilibrium. The land itself, once healthy and self-sustaining, became an active participant in its own undoing. This is what climate scientists mean when they describe certain natural systems as having tipping points, thresholds beyond which a small additional change produces an outsized, sometimes irreversible shift, rather than a proportional response. The Green Sahara. According to this now widely supported model, appears to have been exactly this kind of system, stable and resilient for thousands of years, and then once a critical threshold was crossed, unable to sustain itself even as the underlying orbital forcing that had originally undone it continued to change at its usual unhurried pace. The land dried out far faster than the sky above it actually demanded, because the land in dying hastened its own end. I want to pause here and be honest about where the genuine scientific uncertainty still lies, because this channel has never been in the business of presenting settled science as more finished than it actually is. Researchers continue to debate the precise speed of this transition, and the answer appears to vary considerably by region, which makes sense, given how unevenly the Green Sahara had already begun drying in the preceding centuries. Some lake basins in the eastern Sahara show evidence of a relatively swift collapse. Others, particularly in parts of the western and southern Sahara, appear to have held on to wetter conditions for a longer, more gradual decline stretching across additional centuries. The most widely accepted reconstruction today treats the end of the African Humid Period not as a single continental event happening everywhere at once, but as a patchwork of regional collapses, some abrupt, some more drawn out, unfolding across a broad window of time that likely spanned somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, with the most dramatic shifts concentrated toward the more rapid end of that range in a number of well-studied locations. There is also continuing debate over how much human activity itself may have contributed to this collapse, beyond the purely climatic mechanisms already at work. A handful of researchers have proposed that the intensive cattle grazing practiced across the Sahara during its centuries of abundance, the very herding culture we spent so much time exploring earlier in this story, may have accelerated vegetation loss in certain already stressed regions, with livestock stripping grasses faster than they could regenerate once rainfall began to decline. This remains a genuinely contested hypothesis, rather than an established consensus, and other researchers argue the climatic feedback mechanism alone is sufficient to explain the transition without invoking human overgrazing as a meaningful contributing factor. It is one of those questions the evidence as it currently stands simply does not allow us to answer with full confidence, though it raises an uncomfortable and strangely familiar thought, doesn't it? The idea that a thriving human culture's own success, its growing herds and expanding settlements, might have quietened, even slightly hastened, the end of the very world that made that success possible. What makes all of this so difficult to fully grasp, even now with satellite data and sediment cores and decades of careful research behind us, is how invisible a shift of this speed would have remained to the people actually living through it. A transition unfolding over 2 or 3 centuries still spans multiple human generations. A grandparent might recall lush grazing land in their childhood that their grandchildren would never see at all, but within any single adult lifetime, the change might register as nothing more than a run of harder years, drier seasons, herds that had to travel a little farther each decade to find adequate water. There was no single dramatic moment, no one afternoon when the world visibly ended. There was only region by region a slow tightening that eventually cumulatively became impossible to mistake for anything other than a fundamental and permanent change in the nature of the land itself. And this is where the story now turns toward its hardest chapter, because understanding the mechanism behind this collapse The feedback loops and threshold dynamics that explain why the drying accelerated the way it did only tells us how the world changed. It does not yet tell us what that change actually meant for the people who had built their entire way of life around a landscape that was now region by region turning against them. And to understand what this collapse actually cost in human terms, it helps to think first about water itself and about just how little margin for error a pastoral community operating at the edge of viability actually has. A herd of cattle requires a genuinely significant volume of water every single day, not occasionally, not seasonally, but daily, without exception for the animals to survive at all. When a lake that once reliably provided that water begins shrinking year after year, a community does not face a single dramatic crisis. It faces an accumulating, grinding calculation repeated every morning about how far the herd can now travel before the water runs out and whether that distance has finally exceeded what the animals and the people walking beside them can survive. This is the texture of what desertification actually meant for the communities living through the sharpest phase of the Sahara's transformation somewhere in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It did not arrive as a single event that people could name and point to. It arrived as an ever-tightening set of choices, each one slightly worse than the one before it, until choices that would once have seemed unthinkable became simply the only options left. Do we slaughter part of the herd now to reduce how much water we need, accepting a smaller, weaker herd for years to come? Do we send the young men and women farther from home than anyone has gone before in search of grazing land that may or may not still exist in the direction they are walking? Do we stay and hope, or do we leave the graves of our parents and grandparents behind along with the land itself, and become something we have never had to be before, people without a fixed home? Archaeological evidence from this period offers a genuinely wrenching window into how these decisions played out. At several sites across the central and eastern Sahara, researchers have documented settlements that show clear signs of sudden, complete abandonment, rather than the slow, orderly transitions visible in the record from a few centuries earlier. Personal items left behind, grinding stones still positioned as though mid-use. In a small number of cases, unburied remains, found in postures and locations that suggest death may have come during the very act of trying to leave, rather than in the relative safety and ritual care of a planned burial. I want to be careful and honest here because the evidence does not allow for dramatic certainty about any single site. What killed these individuals, whether it was thirst, exhaustion, violence, or some combination the bones alone cannot fully reveal, remains a subject researchers continue to investigate rather than a settled fact. But the pattern across multiple sites and multiple regions tells a consistent and sobering story. This was not for everyone a gentle transition into a new way of life. For some communities it was a genuine fight for survival, one that not everybody won. There is a particular category of evidence that brings this human cost into sharper focus than almost anything else recovered from this period, and it concerns the animals themselves rather than the people. At a number of sites, researchers have found cattle remains showing clear signs of malnutrition in their final months of life. Bone density and growth patterns consistent with animals that were slowly starving, even as their owners continued attempting to keep them alive. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because in a culture where cattle represented not just food but wealth, status, spiritual significance, and generations of accumulated care, watching a beloved herd waste away would have carried a weight far beyond simple economic loss. It would have felt for many of these pastoralists like watching a form of slow-motion grief unfold in front of them, one animal at a time, with no way to stop it and increasingly little water left to even try. And yet alongside this hardship, the record also preserves something quietly remarkable, a testament to human resourcefulness under genuine pressure. Not every community facing the drying Sahara simply collapsed or fled in desperation. Many adapted with real ingenuity, reorganizing entire ways of life around a landscape that no longer offered what it once had. Evidence from several regions shows communities shifting almost entirely away from cattle, which required more water than the changing climate could reliably support, toward hardier goats and sheep capable of surviving on sparser, patchier grazing. Others moved their settlements toward the very few water sources reliable enough to sustain a fixed population, effectively concentrating what had once been a broadly dispersed way of life into smaller, more defensible, more tightly organized communities clustered around dwindling oases. Still others appear to have shifted their subsistence strategy toward greater reliance on wild grains and gathered plant foods, hedging against the increasing unpredictability of both rainfall and grazing. None of this reversed the underlying crisis, but it speaks to communities that met catastrophe not with paralysis, but with the same kind of careful generational problem-solving that had built Nabta stone circle centuries earlier. Even at the edge of collapse, these were not people who simply gave up. What did it feel like, do you think, to be a young person coming of age during this period, inheriting stories from grandparents about lakes and grasslands that no longer matched anything you yourself had ever seen? There is something quietly devastating about that particular kind of loss. A landscape remembered only second-hand through the words of elders, while the reality in front of you looks nothing like the world they describe. Several researchers studying the oral traditions of modern pastoral groups descended from Saharan populations have noted persistent cultural memories folded into songs and stories passed down across an almost unimaginable span of generations of ancestral homelands filled with water and abundant grazing. Homelands their communities can no longer place with any geographic certainty. Whether these stories represent a genuine, deep cultural memory of the Green Sahara itself, preserved and reshaped across thousands of years of oral transmission, or whether they reflect something more general about how pastoral cultures everywhere tend to romanticize a lost golden age, remains a question scholars are still genuinely divided over. But it is a haunting possibility to sit with the idea that somewhere in the songs still sung by pastoral communities across parts of Africa today, echoes of this ancient vanished world might still faintly survive. The scale of displacement during this period, though difficult to quantify with precision given the limits of the archaeological record, appears to have been substantial. Population density estimates reconstructed from settlement site counts suggest significant portions of the Sahara's population either perished in the most marginal and hardest hit regions, or relocated toward the shrinking number of areas still capable of sustaining human and animal life. This concentration effect is itself an important detail worth sitting with, because it means the crisis did not simply thin out the Saharan population evenly across a wide area. It squeezed that population into an ever-narrowing set of remaining refuges, which in turn placed enormous new pressure on those specific locations, pressure that some evidence suggests occasionally spilled over into competition and conflict between communities now forced to share resources that had once, in the abundant centuries of the Green Sahara, been plentiful enough for everyone. Among the refugees that absorbed this displaced population, one stands out above all others in its long-term historical significance, and it is worth naming clearly here, even though its fuller story belongs to a later part of our journey tonight. The Nile Valley, running like a permanent green thread through what would otherwise have been an increasingly hostile stretch of northeastern Africa, offered something the rest of the drying Sahara increasingly could not. A source of water utterly independent of the collapsing monsoon system, fed instead by rains falling far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands and East African lake region. As Saharan pastoral communities found their traditional lands failing around them, many appear to have migrated steadily eastward and northward toward this one remaining reliable artery of water, carrying with them their cattle, their traditions, their accumulated generations of pastoral and organizational knowledge. What they brought with them and what it eventually helped build is a thread this story will return to. But for now, it is enough to notice the shape of the pattern. A vast, dispersed, thriving world slowly funneling itself toward a single narrow, life-sustaining valley. The pressure of an entire region's worth of hardship concentrating itself, drop by drop, family by family, into one of the most consequential migrations in ancient human history. Not every community made that journey or survived long enough to attempt it. The evidence is honest about this even when it is difficult to sit with. Some settlements simply vanish from the archaeological record during this period, their fate unrecoverable from the physical evidence alone. Their people either dispersed beyond any trace we can currently identify or lost entirely to a crisis the land no longer offers any way to fully reconstruct. This is, I think, one of the quieter tragedies embedded in this story. The fact that some human communities who once painted their cattle with such evident care and buried their dead with such evident tenderness simply disappear from history without leaving behind enough of a record for us to properly mourn them by name, or even to know with any real certainty exactly what became of them in the end. What remains scattered across the increasingly arid landscape these communities once called home is a kind of quiet monument to everything this world had been. Rock art panels still vivid in places despite thousands of years of exposure continuing to show cattle grazing beside water that vanished millennia before any modern person would ever stand there to look at them. Grinding stones and pottery fragments left behind in settlements their owners never returned to reclaim. Burial mounds, carefully constructed with a level of ritual care that speaks to a people who believed right up until the end that their dead deserved to be honoured properly, even as the world around them was quietly irreversibly coming apart. It is easy from the distance of thousands of years to reduce all of this to sediment cores and isotope ratios and settlement abandonment statistics. But underneath every single one of those numbers is a person, a family, a community, facing choices none of us would ever want to face and meeting them more often than not with the dignity the physical record can only partially convey. What this landscape still holds buried beneath centuries of drifting sand scattered across sites most of the modern world has never heard of is a far more complete and precise record of exactly how this transformation unfolded than the story I have told you so far can capture on its own. And it is to that physical evidence, the layered proof left behind in stone and soil and bone, that this story turns next. There is a moment in 1981 that deserves a proper place in this story, even though it involves no ancient herder, no ancient lake, nothing at all from the world we have spent the last several hours exploring together. It involves a space shuttle. When the American shuttle Columbia carried a piece of equipment called imaging radar into orbit, that year the scientists operating it were not thinking about the Sahara at all. They were testing a new technology, one designed to bounce radar signals off the Earth's surface and measure what came back. But when that radar passed over the eastern Sahara, something extraordinary happened. The signal did not simply reflect off the surface sand the way everyone expected. It penetrated it in some places by several meters and bounced back instead off something buried beneath something the naked eye and every satellite photograph ever taken before it had completely failed to detect. What the radar revealed etched into the bedrock beneath what had looked for the entire span of recorded human history like uniform featureless desert was a river system. Not a small one. An enormous branching network of ancient channels wide enough and complex enough that researchers immediately recognized they were looking at the buried skeleton of a major drainage system comparable in scale to significant rivers found anywhere else in the world today. These channels had been invisible for thousands of years, patiently filled and covered by drifting sand waiting for a piece of technology capable of seeing straight through the desert's current disguise. Scientists now sometimes refer to portions of this hidden network informally as the radar rivers, and their rediscovery remains one of the more genuinely startling moments in the modern scientific effort to reconstruct the Green Sahara. A reminder that even after more than a century of dedicated study, this landscape is still capable of hiding entire rivers in plain sight. This is in many ways the story of how we actually know any of what I have told you tonight. Not through a single dramatic discovery, but through more than 100 years of patient cumulative investigation. One layer of evidence stacked carefully on top of another, each new technique revealing a little more of a world that had done everything possible across thousands of years of sand and wind to erase itself. And it began as so many chapters of Saharan archaeology do with rock art. The formal scientific rediscovery of the painted and engraved images scattered across the central Sahara is usually credited to a French archaeologist named Henri Lotte, who led an expedition into the Tassili Najer Plateau in 1956, after hearing scattered reports, some going back decades earlier, of remarkable images carved and painted deep in this remote, nearly inaccessible stretch of desert. What Lotte and his team found over months of difficult work in brutal conditions exceeded almost anything they had anticipated. Thousands of individual images spread across hundreds of separate rock shelters, depicting not just cattle and hunting scenes, but what appeared to be entire narrative sequences, ceremonial gatherings, daily life rendered, with a level of detail and artistic sophistication that reshaped how scholars understood the deep prehistory of the entire region. It is worth noting, in fairness to the historical record, that some of Lotte's own interpretations and reproductions of these images were later criticized by subsequent researchers as overly imaginative, in places a reminder that even careful, well-intentioned scholarship benefits from being revisited and refined by later generations working with better tools and more rigorous methods. Modern archaeologists studying Tassili Najer today rely on far more precise documentation techniques than were available in the 1950s, but the fundamental scale and significance of what Lotte's expedition brought to wider attention has never been seriously disputed. Rock art alone, however evocative, cannot tell us when a particular scene was painted, and this is where a very different kind of science enters the story. Dating rock art directly has historically been one of the most difficult challenges in Saharan archaeology, since the mineral pigments typically used contain no organic material suitable for radiocarbon dating. The standard technique used to date organic remains by measuring the decay of a radioactive form of carbon absorbed by living things during their lifetime. Researchers have instead had to rely on a combination of methods dating organic material found in the same archaeological layer as a painted rock shelter, analyzing the geological weathering patterns on exposed rock surfaces, and comparing stylistic changes across different panels to build a relative chronology, before cross-referencing that chronology against more precisely dated sites nearby. The result is a dating framework that carries real honestly acknowledged uncertainty, particularly for the oldest images, and scholars continue to debate the exact age of some of the earliest and most significant panels within a range that can span several centuries. Sediment cores, the kind pulled from ancient lake beds and from the ocean floor off the West African coast, offer a different and in some ways more reliable window into this story, precisely because they do not depend on interpreting human artwork at all. Each core is essentially a vertical timeline with the oldest material at the bottom and the most recent near the top, and researchers can extract that timeline by drilling a long narrow cylinder straight down through accumulated layers of mud, dust and organic material that may represent tens of thousands of years of continuous deposition. Within these cores, scientists look for several different kinds of evidence simultaneously. Pollen grains, remarkably durable and often preserved in extraordinary detail, reveal what kinds of plants were growing nearby at the time. Each layer was dusseted, allowing researchers to track the transition from desert shrub to grassland and back again with genuine precision. Diatoms. Microscopic algae with hard silica shells indicate the presence and even the salinity and depth of ancient lake water. And the dust itself, blown in from the surrounding desert during drier periods and largely absent during wetter ones, provides a direct physical record of exactly how exposed and arid the surrounding landscape was at any given moment in the past. What makes this kind of evidence so powerful is its consistency across multiple independently studied sites. A single core from a single lake might reflect purely local conditions that do not represent the wider region. But when researchers compare cores taken from lake beds scattered across thousands of miles of the Sahara and from ocean sediment far off the coast and find broadly the same pattern of rapid vegetation decline, occurring within a similar though not identical window of time, that consistency becomes very difficult to explain by anything other than a genuine large-scale climatic transformation. This is in essence how scientists move from a reasonable hypothesis about the Green Sahara towards something closer to settled scientific consensus, not through any single discovery, but through the accumulated weight of many separate lines of evidence, all pointing toward the same conclusion. There is a particular site that deserves mention here, both for its scientific value and for how strange it is to picture even now. In the 1960s, researchers working in the Tenere Desert region of what is now Niger, one of the most punishing and lifeless stretches of the entire Sahara, uncovered a burial site that came to be known somewhat hauntingly as the Tenerean Culture Cemetery, later the subject of extensive excavation led by American paleontologist Paul Sereno and his team in the early 2000s. What they found arranged across a stretch of desert that receives in a typical year essentially no rainfall at all were the remains of more than 200 individuals buried across a span of centuries roughly 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, alongside the bones of fish crocodiles and hippopotamuses. One particular burial found at the site, sometimes called the triple burial, shows an adult woman and two children arranged together with clear evidence of a floral bed placed beneath them, and their hands positioned in a way that suggests deliberate tender arrangement at the time of interment. Isotopic analysis of the human remains confirms a diet rich in fish entirely consistent with life beside a permanent body of water, in a location that today sits deep within one of the driest, most hostile environments on the planet. Standing at that site in the searing modern heat of the Tenere, with nothing visible for miles but sand and stone, it becomes almost impossible not to feel the sheer distance between the world that buried those bodies and this world that eventually excavated them again. Beyond the human and biological evidence, geology itself continues to offer new tools for reconstructing the story. Satellite imagery, refined considerably since that first shuttle mission in 1981, has allowed researchers to map ancient lake shorelines across the Sahara with increasing precision, identifying the faint ring-like terracing that forms naturally around a body of water as its level fluctuates over centuries. These shoreline traces, invisible from ground level but clearly visible from above, have allowed scientists to reconstruct the approximate size and depth of ancient lakes across dozens of sites, including the massive Lake Mega-Chad Basin discussed earlier in this story, whose ancient high-water shoreline remarkably can still be traced today as a subtle ridge in the surrounding landscape, faint evidence of a shore that once held back a body of water rivaling some of the largest lakes on Earth. None of this evidence, it is worth saying, plainly arrived without genuine scientific disagreement along the way, and some of that disagreement continues even now. Researchers have long debated, for instance, the precise timing and pace of the final desertification across different regions, with some studies suggesting a swifter, more uniform collapse, and others pointing toward a more staggered, regionally variable decline, stretching across a longer window. The evidence remains incomplete in certain areas simply because so much of the Sahara remains logistically difficult and dangerous to survey thoroughly, meaning our current picture, however detailed compared to what earlier generations of researchers had available, is still very likely missing pieces that future expeditions and future technology will eventually fill in. Isn't that a strange thing to sit with, that even a story this old, this seemingly settled, is still in a very real sense being actively written by researchers working right now in universities and desert field camps, piecing together evidence the rest of us will not fully understand the significance of for years to come? What all of this evidence gives us taken together, the rock art and the radiocarbon dates the sediment cores and the buried radar rivers, the burial sites and the isotope analysis, is not a perfect, complete picture. It never could be given how much time has passed and how thoroughly the desert has worked to erase its own history. But it gives us something remarkably close to a genuine, physically grounded reconstruction of a world that for most of recorded human history, nobody even suspected had existed at all. And it raises a question this story has not yet fully answered, one that researchers themselves continue to argue over with real intensity, because agreeing on what happened to the Green Sahara has always proven considerably easier than agreeing on exactly why it happened the way it did, and how much of what unfolded there was written into the climate itself, and how much was shaped in ways still being debated by the very people who called that vanished world home. Ask 10 different climate scientists what actually caused the end of the Green Sahara, and you will very likely get 10 answers that agree on the broad outline and disagree sometimes sharply on the details underneath it. This is not a sign of a field in disarray. It is, if anything, a sign of a genuinely difficult scientific problem being worked at seriously by researchers who would rather sit with honest uncertainty than pretend to a confidence the evidence does not support. And working through where that disagreement actually lies tells us something important, not just about ancient climate, but about how fragile the line can be between a stable world and a collapsing one. The foundational explanation one almost no serious researcher disputes concerns the Earth's orbit itself, and it is worth understanding properly because it is a genuinely elegant piece of science. The Earth does not orbit the Sun in a perfectly fixed, unchanging pattern. Its axis wobbles slowly over a cycle lasting roughly 26,000 years, a phenomenon astronomers call precession gradually changing, which part of the Earth's yearly orbit lines up with which season. This wobble alters in a still predictable, mathematically precise way how much solar energy different parts of the Earth receive at different times of year. Around 11,000 years ago, this cycle happened to position the Northern Hemisphere's summer in a way that intensified solar heating over North Africa, and that intensified heating strengthened the West African monsoon, pulling its rains substantially farther north than they reach in the world we live in today. This mechanism, known as orbital forcing, is not a hypothesis under serious dispute. It is about as close to settled science as ancient climatology gets confirmed by the mathematical models that accurately predict the timing of the Green Sahara's beginning and eventually its retreat based purely on orbital mechanics that have nothing to do with rock art or sediment cores at all. Where the real scientific disagreement begins is in the details of what happened next, specifically why the ending in so many well-studied regions appears to have unfolded so much faster than the slow gradual pace of the underlying orbital shift would predict on its own. We touched earlier on the leading explanation, the vegetation feedback mechanism, in which dying plant cover accelerates its own collapse by reducing the very moisture recycling that helps sustain regional rainfall in the first place. This remains among climate scientists actively working on Saharan paleoclimate today probably the single most widely supported explanation for the abruptness observed in the sediment record. But even within that broad consensus, researchers disagree meaningfully about the details, about exactly how large a role vegetation feedback played relative to other reinforcing factors, and about whether the transition was genuinely as sudden in every region as the most dramatic sediment cores suggest, or whether some of that apparent abruptness reflects gaps and limitations in the sampling itself, rather than the reality on the ground. There is a second scientific camp, smaller but persistent, that has argued for decades that atmospheric dust itself may have played a larger role in accelerating the Sahara's end than the vegetation feedback model alone accounts for. The logic here runs roughly as follows. As the land began to dry and vegetation began to thin, exposed soil would have started releasing far more airborne dust than the well-vegetated landscape of earlier centuries ever produced. That dust, once lofted into the atmosphere in sufficient quantity, can itself suppress rainfall by altering how sunlight interacts with the atmosphere, and by interfering with the formation of rain-bearing clouds. In other words, according to this model, dust from the drying land did not simply result from desertification, it actively worsened it, creating a second atmospheric feedback loop, layered on top of the vegetation feedback loop already discussed, each one reinforcing the other, each one making the collapse more self-sustaining than either mechanism could have produced entirely on its own. Researchers who favour this dust-focused explanation point to ice cores from Greenland remarkably, which show a measurable increase in African dust deposits during precisely this window of Saharan collapse, offering physical evidence thousands of miles from the Sahara itself that something significant was happening to the amount of dust that continent was throwing into the global atmosphere. Other researchers argue this dust increase is better understood as a consequence of the drying rather than a major independent driver of it, and the debate between these two framings, vegetation feedback as the primary engine versus a combined vegetation and dust feedback system, remains genuinely active in the scientific literature today. Then there is the question of human involvement, which tends to provoke the strongest reactions among researchers, in part because it touches on something larger than pure climate science, the uncomfortable possibility that a thriving human culture might have played a meaningful role in undoing the very world that sustained it. The hypothesis, sometimes called the overgrazing model, suggests that the intensive pastoral economy that had built up across the Green Sahara over thousands of years, all those carefully managed cattle herds we spent so much time exploring earlier, this story may have stripped vegetation faster than it could naturally recover once rainfall began its initial gentle decline, effectively giving the underlying climate shift an extra push toward the tipping point discussed earlier. Proponents of this view point to the timing itself as suggestive, noting that the most severe and rapid phases of desertification in certain well-studied regions appear to coincide reasonably closely with periods of peak population density and herd size exactly when grazing pressure on the landscape would have been at its highest. Critics of the overgrazing hypothesis, and there are many serious ones within the field, argue this timing correlation does not prove causation, and that the sheer scale and speed of vegetation loss recorded in sediment cores across such an enormous geographic area, spanning thousands of miles and multiple distinct pastoral cultures with very different herding intensities, is difficult to explain through human activity alone, especially given how relatively modest Saharan population densities were compared to what modern agricultural societies would eventually achieve. The most widely accepted position among researchers today treats human grazing pressure as at most a regional accelerant in certain already environmentally stressed areas, rather than a primary continental driver, with the underlying combination of orbital forcing and vegetation feedback doing the great majority of the explanatory work. But the debate has not fully resolved, and it likely never will resolve with complete certainty, given how difficult it is to isolate human impact from purely climatic decline using evidence this old and this geographically dispersed. What makes this particular disagreement feel different from a dry academic dispute? At least to me, sitting with all of this evidence is what it implies about the nature of collapse more broadly. If the overgrazing hypothesis holds any real weight, even as a regional accelerant rather than a primary cause, it suggests something quietly unsettling about the relationship between a civilization's success and its own vulnerability. The Green Sahara's pastoral culture reached its peak precisely because it had gotten so skilled at extracting a good living from its landscape, refining herding techniques, growing herds, expanding settlements. If that very success, that accumulated skill and scale, ended up narrowing the margin available when the climate eventually turned against them, it would mean the seeds of vulnerability were planted not by carelessness or ignorance, but by competence itself, by simply doing well at the thing they had always done in a world that no longer had room to absorb doing it quite so well. Is that not one of the more sobering patterns to sit with tonight? The idea that a civilization's own considerable strengths can, under the right circumstances, quietly become the very thing that narrows its path forward. There is a further layer of disagreement worth mentioning concerning not why the Sahara dried, but how completely it actually did, and how uniform that dryness has remained ever since. It would be easy to imagine the transition from Green Sahara to modern desert as a single permanent irreversible event, a door closing once and never reopening. The actual paleoclimate record is somewhat more complicated than that. Evidence from several sediment cores suggests the Sahara may have experienced at least one or two smaller, shorter-lived wet intervals, even after the main collapse, brief partial recoveries lasting perhaps a few centuries, before drying out again, echoes of a system still for a time capable of occasional recovery before finally settling into the arid stability we recognize today. The evidence for these secondary wet phases remains genuinely debated, drawn from a smaller and less consistent set of sites than the evidence for the main African Humid Period and its primary collapse, and some researchers argue the signal may reflect purely local conditions rather than any broader regional recovery. But if these brief green interludes did occur in any meaningful way, they add yet another layer of complexity to a story that already resists easy, single-sentence summary, a reminder that even an ending, when you look closely enough, rarely arrives in one clean final motion. One more thread of scientific debate deserves mention here, because it connects this ancient story to a question with real modern resonance, whether cautiously drawn or not. A number of climate researchers have pointed to the mechanisms behind the Green Sahara's collapse, particularly the vegetation feedback loop that turned a modest initial decline into a rapid self-reinforcing transformation, as a genuinely useful case study for understanding how modern ecosystems might respond to comparatively small gradual environmental pressures once certain thresholds are crossed. This is a careful, measured scientific comparison rather than a dramatic warning, and researchers working in this space are generally quick to note the many differences between ancient orbital forcing and the entirely different mechanisms driving climate change in the world we live in today. But the underlying principle the Sahara demonstrates that natural systems do not always decline in neat, proportional, easily predictable increments, that a slow initial push can sometimes trigger a fast, disproportionate response. Once a system's internal feedback loops turn against it, remains among the researchers who study it. One of the more quietly significant lessons this ancient landscape still has to teach. None of these debates, it is worth saying, clearly change the fundamental shape of the story this channel has spent the last several hours telling you. The Green Sahara existed. It sustained a rich, complex, genuinely remarkable human civilization for thousands of years. And it collapsed more rapidly in many regions than anyone studying it a century ago would have believed possible, reshaping not just a landscape but the lives, the migrations, and ultimately the deeper history of an entire portion of the ancient world. What remains genuinely open, what researchers continue arguing about in conference halls and academic journals even now, is the finer texture of exactly how and why that collapse unfolded the way it did. A question this particular chapter of the Sahara's story may never fully close, however many new cores are drilled, however much new radar imagery becomes available in the years ahead. What is not in serious dispute, though, whatever the precise mechanism behind it, is what came after. Because the same collapse that emptied the Sahara of the world we spent so much of tonight exploring did not simply end there in loss and abandonment. It fed quietly and consequentially into the rise of something else entirely, a civilization whose name almost everyone listening tonight already knows, built in no small part by people carrying the memory, the skill, and the accumulated resilience of the very world that had just been taken from them. Picture for a moment what the Nile Valley must have looked like to someone arriving there after a lifetime spent chasing shrinking water across an increasingly hostile Sahara. A single permanent, impossibly reliable river flooding every single year, with a predictability that must have seemed to eyes that had watched lake after lake fail and vanish almost supernatural. That flood driven by monsoon rains falling far away in the Ethiopian highlands had nothing whatsoever to do with the collapsing weather system that had just destroyed the world these migrants came from, and that disconnection is precisely what made the valley so valuable. It was in the truest sense a lifeline utterly indifferent to the crisis unfolding around it. The archaeological and genetic evidence for this migration has grown considerably more detailed over the past 2 decades, and it paints a picture more gradual and more complicated than a single dramatic exodus. Rather than one mass movement arriving all at once, the evidence suggests a steady, sustained trickle of Saharan pastoral communities moving toward the Nile across a span of several centuries, arriving in overlapping waves as different regions of the drying Sahara reached their own individual breaking points at somewhat different times. Some of these communities settled directly along the river itself. Others moved into the fertile margins just beyond the immediate floodplain areas, that still received enough residual moisture to support grazing, even as the deeper desert beyond continued its retreat into true aridity. What all of them brought with them, whatever their specific point of origin across the vast Saharan landscape, was a set of skills and social structures forged over thousands of years of pastoral life skills that would prove in ways almost nobody arriving could have anticipated extraordinarily well suited to what came next. Here is where the story requires real care, because it would be a significant overstatement to suggest that Saharan migrants single-handedly created Egyptian civilization, and serious historians do not make that claim. The Nile Valley already supported its own indigenous population with a long, independent history of settlement stretching back many thousands of years before the Sahara began its final collapse. What the archaeological and genetic record does support with growing confidence is something more nuanced and in some ways more interesting, a significant cultural and demographic merging, in which Saharan pastoral traditions, social organization, and quite possibly certain spiritual and symbolic practices flowed into and blended with the existing Nile Valley populations during precisely the centuries when Egyptian society was consolidating into the more centralized complex form that would eventually produce the pharaonic state. Scholars continue to debate the precise proportional weight of the Saharan contribution relative to indigenous Nile Valley development, and it would be dishonest to present this as a fully settled question. But the timing itself is difficult to dismiss as coincidence, the Sahara's most severe desertification unfolding in the same centuries that Egyptian society was undergoing its most significant social transformation, moving from scattered independent settlements toward the unified, hierarchical civilization that would eventually crown its first pharaoh. There is a particular thread of evidence worth sitting with here, because it connects directly back to something explored earlier in this story. Cattle, remember, were never simply livestock to the pastoral communities of the Green Sahara. They were wealth status, and in many communities something approaching spiritual significance, animals honoured in burial and rendered with individual care across thousands of rock art panels. That same reverence for cattle appears prominently in early Egyptian religious and symbolic life well before the more famous animal-associated deities of later Egyptian religion took their fully developed form. The cow-associated goddess Hathor, who would become one of the most enduring and beloved figures in the entire Egyptian pantheon across 3,000 years of continuous worship, carries a set of symbolic associations: motherhood, nourishment, the life-giving power of cattle, that many researchers studying this period find difficult to fully separate from the deep cattle culture of the Saharan pastoralists who migrated into the Nile Valley during these same critical centuries. Nobody can prove a direct, unbroken line connecting a specific Saharan herding tradition to a specific later Egyptian religious practice with total certainty, and the evidence remains genuinely open to interpretation. But the resonance is striking enough that it has become one of the more actively discussed threads in our research on Egyptian civilization's deeper origins. Beyond religion and symbolism, there is a more directly organizational legacy worth considering, and it returns us to a place we visited earlier in this story. Recall the stone circle at Nabta Playa, built roughly 7,000 years ago by a community coordinated, patient enough and confident enough in its own future to construct an astronomical monument predating Stonehenge by a significant margin. Several archaeologists studying the deeper roots of Egyptian civilization have pointed to sites like Nabta Playa as tantalizing early evidence that the organizational and astronomical knowledge later associated with pharaonic Egypt, the careful tracking of solar cycles that would eventually underpin the Egyptian calendar itself, along with the coordinated large-scale labor and social hierarchy required to plan and build enormous monuments, may have roots stretching back into exactly this kind of Saharan pastoral tradition carried eastward across the centuries of migration into the valley, where it would eventually find its most famous expression in stone. I want to pause on that thought for a moment because it carries a genuine weight worth sitting with quietly. The pyramids of Giza are among the most recognized human structures on the entire planet, built by a civilization whose name has echoed across nearly 5,000 years of continuous human memory, may owe some meaningful portion of their deepest cultural and organizational roots to a world that by the time those pyramids rose had already been gone for well over 1,000 years. A green and thriving Sahara remembered, if it was remembered at all, only as a distant ancestral story passed down through generations who had never themselves seen a lake in the middle of what was now simply endless, empty sand. Doesn't it change something knowing that one of history's most enduring civilizations may carry quietly folded into its own foundations the inherited memory of a world that had to die in order for it to rise at all? The Nile Valley was not the only refuge absorbing displaced Saharan populations during this period, and it is worth resisting the temptation to tell this story as though Egypt were the sole destination, the single tidy resolution to an otherwise sprawling and complicated migration. Evidence suggests substantial movement in other directions as well, southward and westward, as pastoral communities carried their cattle herding traditions deeper into regions of Africa that had never experienced the green Sahara's abundance directly, but that offered enough residual grazing and water to sustain a modified version of the pastoral lifestyle these migrants had known. Some researchers trace the spread of cattle domestication techniques across large portions of sub-Saharan Africa during subsequent centuries directly to this Saharan diaspora, suggesting that pastoral traditions still practiced by cattle herding communities across parts of East and West Africa today may carry genuine traceable roots back to the Green Sahara's collapse, a legacy dispersed across an entire continent rather than concentrated in any single destination. This dispersal helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange: the sheer scale and persistence of cattle culture across so much of Africa in the millennia that followed the Sahara's transformation. Communities as far apart as the cattle-herding peoples of parts of East Africa and pastoral groups found much farther west share certain deep cultural threads around cattle wealth, ceremony, and social organization that some anthropologists and archaeologists believe trace back, at least in part, to this single shared ancestral disruption, a scattering of related pastoral traditions carried outward in every direction by a crisis that gave displaced communities little choice but to seek new ground wherever they could find it. The evidence for these specific cultural through lines varies considerably in strength from region to region, and scholars continue to debate how much of this shared cattle culture reflects genuine historical connection back to Saharan migrants specifically versus independent parallel development among unrelated pastoral societies facing broadly similar ecological pressures across the continent. It is a genuinely open question in ongoing research, and one unlikely to be fully resolved without considerably more genetic and archaeological work across a wider set of sites than currently exist. There is also a demographic consequence to this collapse worth naming, plainly because it represents one of the more sobering, less celebrated aspects of this entire story. Not every displaced community found a viable refuge. Regional population estimates reconstructed from settlement density across the deep Sahara suggest substantial net population decline across the broader region during the centuries of most severe desertification, a decline that almost certainly reflects some meaningful combination of outward migration and outright mortality. Communities that simply could not reach water in time or could not sustain themselves once they arrived somewhere new, already strained by the arrival of other displaced groups competing for the same shrinking resources. It is difficult working from archaeological evidence alone to separate these two forces with real precision, to know how much of the population decliner reflects people successfully relocating elsewhere versus people who did not survive the transition at all. This uncertainty is not a gap in the storytelling. It is an honest reflection of what the evidence itself can and cannot tell us. A reminder that behind every dry demographic estimate sits real, unrecoverable human loss that the archaeological record can only gesture toward, rather than fully document. What emerges from all of this taken together is a picture considerably more consequential than a simple regional climate story confined to one stretch of desert. The collapse of the Green Sahara appears to have functioned as something closer to a hidden engine behind some of the most significant demographic and cultural developments across an enormous swath of ancient Africa, feeding population skill and tradition into the rise of pharaonic Egypt along the Nile, while simultaneously scattering pastoral culture outward across the rest of the continent in a diaspora, whose echoes in the form of enduring cattle-centered traditions among various African peoples arguably persist in some form, even now, thousands of years later. A landscape's slow, patient death, in other words, helped author the birth of civilizations and cultural traditions still recognizable in fragments today. It is worth returning before this chapter of the story closes to that woman standing at the edge of a lake in the opening moments of tonight's journey, cupping water in her hands, utterly unaware that the pattern of rain sustaining her world had already quietly begun its long retreat. We do not know her name or the name of her community, or which direction her descendants ultimately travelled once the water she depended on finally failed. But it is entirely possible, given everything the evidence now suggests, that some line of descendants from people very much like her eventually walked east toward a river that never stopped flowing, carrying with them a way of understanding cattle community and the careful tracking of the sky that would help lay quiet, largely unacknowledged foundations beneath one of the most famous civilizations human history has ever produced. And what became of that inheritance, how it was carried reshaped, and eventually written into a landscape most of the modern world still recognizes on sight is a thread. This story is not quite finished pulling on just yet. There is a particular kind of water that still exists beneath the Sahara today, and it is worth pausing on because it connects everything this story has explored so far to the present moment in a way that might genuinely surprise you. Beneath vast stretches of the eastern Sahara, sealed away under layers of sandstone, sits one of the largest reserves of freshwater anywhere on the planet, a vast underground formation known to hydrologists as the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System, spanning parts of modern Egypt, Libya, Chad and Sudan. This is not water that fell as rain last year or even last century. It is fossil water, meaning it accumulated during exactly the period this story has spent so many hours exploring, soaking down through soil and rock during the millennia of the Green Sahara, and then becoming sealed beneath the surface as the climate above it dried and the recharge that once replenished it stopped almost entirely. In a very real physical sense, the abundance of that ancient world never actually disappeared. It simply went underground, and it is sitting there, still in quantities so large that some estimates place the total volume in the range of tens of thousands of cubic kilometers of buried inheritance from our world. Most of the modern population living above it will never know existed at all. That water is not simply a scientific curiosity, it is actively being used today, and the story of its modern extraction carries its own quiet complexity worth sitting with. Libya, beginning in the 1980s, undertook a massive infrastructure project known as the Great Man-Made River, drawing on this ancient aquifer to pipe water hundreds of miles to coastal cities and agricultural land in what remains one of the largest civil engineering projects ever undertaken. It is a strange, almost poetic continuity water gathered by rains that fell during the age of Nabta Playa's stone circle still thousands of years later, sustaining human life across the same general landscape, even though everything about how that water reaches people today would be entirely unrecognizable to the pastoralists who once knelt beside open lakes to drink. Hydrologists studying the aquifer generally agree that because it receives essentially no meaningful modern recharge, current rates of extraction are in the long run unsustainable, drawing down a finite ancient reserve rather than tapping into any renewable modern source. It is a sobering thought that the last true legacy of the Green Sahara's abundance is itself now a resource with a countdown attached to it. Above ground, the traces left by that ancient world are in most places almost invisible to an untrained eye, and this is one of the reasons the Green Sahara remained essentially unknown to the wider world for as long as it did. But scattered across the desert in locations that require real effort and often real risk, to reach the physical record survives with startling clarity. The rock art sites explored earlier in this story, at Tassili Nadja and the Gilf Kabir and dozens of lesser-known locations across the central Sahara remain visible today, largely because of the very aridity that ended the world. They depict the extreme dryness that followed the Green Sahara's collapse, having inadvertently preserved these images far better than a wetter, more biologically active climate ever could have. There is something quietly ironic in that the desert's harshness serving as an accidental museum, protecting the memory of the very world it replaced. These sites face real modern pressures, and it would be incomplete to tell this part of the story without acknowledging them honestly. Increased accessibility in recent decades, along with periods of regional political instability across parts of the Sahara, has left some rock art locations vulnerable to vandalism, unauthorized excavation, and in certain documented cases outright looting with portable artifacts and even fragments of painted rock removed from sites for private sale. Organizations, including UNESCO, have worked to designate and protect several of the most significant locations, Tassili Nadja among them, as World Heritage Sites, though enforcement across such a vast and remote landscape remains genuinely difficult. Researchers in the field describe an uncomfortable tension in their own work, a genuine desire to study and document these sites thoroughly balanced against an awareness that increased attention and accessibility can sometimes accelerate the very degradation they are trying to prevent and understand. There is a more recent and more hopeful thread to this modern story, though, one that returns us to the deep climatic mechanisms explored earlier and asks a genuinely fascinating question. If the Green Sahara existed because of a slow, predictable wobble in the Earth's orbit, and if that same orbital cycle continues turning unbothered by anything happening on the planet's surface, does that mean the Sahara might someday become green again on its own? The honest scientific answer is a careful, qualified yes, though the timescale involved stretches so far beyond any human frame of reference that it offers little practical comfort to anyone living today. Climate models built on the same orbital precession cycle responsible for the original African Humid Period suggest the conditions that once pulled monsoon rains north across the Sahara will eventually recur as the wobble completes further stages of its roughly 26,000-year cycle. Researchers generally place this next potential greening somewhere in the range of 10 to 15,000 years from now, number so large it resists any real emotional grasp, but one that carries a certain quiet reassurance. Nonetheless, the knowledge that the desert we know today is not on the deepest timescale that governs this landscape a permanent condition at all, but simply the current chapter in a very long, very slow, very patient cycle of transformation. Some researchers have gone further and pursued a more immediate, deliberately human question, whether elements of that ancient green landscape might be encouraged to return far sooner than any natural orbital cycle would produce on its own. Since the 1970s, various initiatives across the African continent have explored large-scale tree planting and land restoration efforts along the Sahara's southern margin, an ambitious, ongoing, multinational effort now generally known as the Great Green Wall, intended to combat the modern southward creep of desertification that continues even today to threaten agricultural land across the Sahel region bordering the desert. The project's results have been genuinely mixed, and it would be misleading to present it as a simple, unambiguous success story. Some sections have shown real measurable regreening, while others have struggled against funding shortfalls, difficult growing conditions, and the sheer scale of the challenge, restoring land across a distance roughly comparable to the width of the entire African continent. What the project does represent, whatever its ultimate outcome is, a strange, quiet echo of the ancient story this video has spent so many hours exploring. Communities today facing many of the same fundamental pressures that pastoral Saharan communities faced thousands of years ago. Land drying, water growing scarce, working with whatever tools their own era makes available to try to hold back or perhaps even reverse a pattern their distant ancestors could only adapt to and endure. There is one more modern thread worth drawing into this story, and it concerns the people rather than the land itself, because the descendants of the Green Sahara's ancient pastoral world have never fully disappeared whatever the desert eventually did to the landscape they once called home. Populations such as the Tuareg semi-nomadic pastoral people who have inhabited the Central Sahara for many centuries maintain cultural traditions, including certain distinctive forms of dress, craftsmanship and social organization that some anthropologists and historians believe carry genuine, if difficult to fully verify, threads of continuity reaching back toward the pastoral cultures of the Sahara's ancient past. Genetic studies of various Saharan and Sahelian populations conducted over the past 2 decades have identified deep, ancient lineages consistent with long-term regional continuity in certain areas. Alongside clear evidence of the kind of population movement and mixing the earlier parts of this story have already explored in detail, scholars remain genuinely divided over how directly to draw a line connecting any specific modern community to the specific pastoral cultures who painted the rock art at Tassili Najer, since so many centuries and so much movement separate the two, and claiming too clean or direct a lineage risks flattening a much more complicated layered history of migration, mixing and cultural change across thousands of years. But the broader continuity of pastoral tradition, cattle culture, and deep adaptive knowledge of this difficult landscape passed down across an almost unbroken span of human generations remains one of the more quietly moving aspects of this entire story. A living thread still walking across the same general landscape where the story we have spent tonight exploring first began. It is worth sitting for a moment with just how much this single ancient climatic transformation still touches the world we actually live in today. It's shaped in ways this story has traced across many hours now, the demographic and cultural foundations that fed into one of history's most enduring civilizations along the Nile. It scattered pastoral traditions across an entire continent, traditions that persist in modified form. Among cattle-herding peoples from East Africa to West Africa even now, it sealed away beneath the sand a reserve of ancient water still being drawn upon by modern nations. Today, water that will not last forever, precisely because the world that created it is gone. It left behind exposed on rock walls across some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on Earth, one of the largest and most significant collections of ancient art anywhere on the planet. Images that continue to reshape our understanding of what human life was actually like 10,000 years ago in a place almost nobody imagined could once have been green. And it offers, through the patient ongoing work of climate scientists still studying its collapse, some of the clearest available evidence for how fragile the line can be between a stable, thriving natural system and one that has quietly, irreversibly crossed into an entirely different state. What remains after everything is a landscape that holds both truths simultaneously without contradiction, the emptiest, most punishing desert most of us can picture, and the buried, fading but not entirely erased memory of a world that was for a span of centuries longer than the entire history of ancient Egypt itself, genuinely green. Both of those things are true about the same stretch of ground. Both of them in their own way are still shaping the world above and beneath that sand today. And as this story now moves toward its close, it is worth carrying that particular kind of doubleness with us, the desert as it is, and the desert as it once remarkably briefly against everything we assume about permanence used to be. Well, there is one more piece of evidence worth returning to before this story finally comes to rest, and it comes not from a laboratory or a sediment core, but from a single grave uncovered decades ago in the Tenere, the same burial ground mentioned earlier in this journey. Among the more than 200 individuals recovered from that stretch of desert, one particular find has stayed with researchers in a way that statistics and isotope readings rarely manage on their own. It is the triple burial an adult woman laid to rest with 2 children, their bodies arranged close together, a bed of flowers placed beneath them, before the sand was returned over their resting place sometime between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. Pollen analysis confirms the flowers were real, gathered deliberately placed with intention by people who had every reason at that exact moment to believe their world was ending around them, and who chose even then to bury their dead with tenderness rather than haste. That single detail, more than any sediment layer or radar image, is perhaps the truest thing this entire story has to offer. Whatever was happening to the rain, to the lakes, to the grazing land that sustained their herds, these people still gathered flowers for their dead. Grief, it turns out, does not wait for better circumstances. Love does not require a stable climate to express itself fully. This is, in the end, what the story of the Green Sahara has always really been about underneath the orbital mechanics, and the vegetation feedback loops and the careful scientific debates over timing and cause. It is a story about what people do when the ground beneath them quite literally stops holding. And what the evidence shows again and again, across seasons of separate small human choices preserved in bone and pigment and buried stone, is something both harder and more hopeful than simple collapse. These were not people who simply gave up when their world began to fail. They adapted their herds, they reorganized their settlements, they built monuments to track the sky, trusting a future they would never personally see. They walked when walking became the only option left, carrying with them not just their animals, but their knowledge, their traditions, their particular way of understanding what mattered, and in doing so, without ever intending to, they helped see the beginnings of one of history's most enduring civilizations along a river that never once stopped flowing. There is a pattern here worth sitting with because it is not unique to the Sahara at all, though the Sahara tells it with unusual clarity. Every civilization, every thriving world any of us has ever studied on this channel has operated under the same quiet, unspoken assumption that governed the lives of those cattle herders drinking from a lake that felt to them permanent. We build our lives, all of us, on top of conditions we assume will hold. Rivers that will keep flowing, rains that will keep falling on schedule, systems, whether climatic or political or economic, that feel from the inside as fixed and unchangeable as the horizon itself. And history this channel has shown you again and again tells a different, more honest story. One where even the most stable-seeming foundations can shift, sometimes slowly across centuries, sometimes with a speed that catches an entire civilization by surprise, long before anyone living through it has the perspective to recognize what is actually happening around them. But history also tells us something else, something this particular story makes unusually visible precisely because so much of what those Saharan pastoralists built managed to survive in fragments across an almost unimaginable span of time. Nothing they created was built to last forever in any literal sense. The lakes they depended on are gone. The grasslands their cattle grazed have been sand for thousands of years. Even the specific communities who painted those rock walls, who arranged flowers beneath their dead, mostly cannot be traced forward with any real precision into the world we live in now. And yet something of them persisted anyway. Not intact, not unchanged, but present, folded into the deep cultural memory of Egyptian civilization, scattered across the pastoral traditions of an entire continent preserved by pure accident in rock art that survived only because the desert that killed the world it depicts also cruelly and generously at once protected the evidence of it ever having existed. That is, I think, one of the deepest truths this story has to offer, and it is worth carrying with you as you drift now towards sleep. Nothing we build is permanent. Every civilization that this channel has ever explored eventually ends in one form or another, sometimes through catastrophe, sometimes through slow, quiet erosion so gradual that no single generation ever quite names it as decline. That is simply the shape of history unchanging across every era we have ever studied together. But endings this story insists are rarely as total as they first appear from a distance. Something almost always survives. A tradition, a technique, a story passed down through generations who no longer remember exactly where it came from. A pattern woven into cloth, a reverence for a particular animal, a way of arranging the dead that still thousands of years later tells us something true about how deeply these people loved each other. The green Sahara did not simply vanish when the rain stopped coming. It changed shape, scattered itself across a continent, and kept living quietly inside civilizations and cultures that never fully knew what they had inherited. Let the pace slow now. The lake is gone. It has been gone for thousands of years. Where the woman once knelt to drink, there is only sand, now endless and pale, under a sky that no longer remembers the clouds it used to hold. Somewhere far to the east, a river still flows the way it has always flowed, carrying in ways almost no one living beside it today could name something of what that lake once meant. Somewhere farther still, in villages scattered across half a continent, cattle are led out at dawn by people who have never heard of Nabta Playa, who could not point to Tassili Niger on a map, who nonetheless move through the world with the knowledge of herding, of patience, of reading the sky that reaches back further than any of them will ever know. History does not usually announce its endings. There was no final day when the Green Sahara officially closed. There was only slowly then, quickly, then finally a world becoming a memory, and a memory becoming a rock painting, and a rock painting becoming thousands of years later the reason a stranger sat in the dark and told you this story tonight. Somewhere in the Tassili Niger right now tonight, while you are lying here listening, the sun is setting over stone walls covered in cattle that have not grazed in 5,000 years. The paint has faded, but it has not disappeared. The animals are still running in ochre and red across rock that remembers a world the desert around it has long since forgotten. That is where we leave them. Not gone, not quite. Just waiting the way old things wait in the last light for someone to look up and see them.